Hi, it's Greg, the Catholic psychotherapist here, and welcome to today's webinar, where we're going to be looking at the definitively Catholic approach to depression and low self-esteem, which blends the beauties of our faith with the best of modern psychology. Okay, so you're about to learn how to understand and address depression and low self-esteem from a Catholic standpoint using a truly Catholic perspective on mental health and the soul. How to master your emotions and find peace and confidence, and thereby how to connect deeply and meaningfully with other people. And it's the simplest, the most direct, and most Catholic way of healing the soul and establishing healthy and peaceful relationships without compromising your Catholic faith, without feeling that you have to hide your faith. I know that some of the people who've come to me have been told by well-meaning professionals that their faith is actually part of the problem, and without any previous learning or experience. Okay, but just a little bit about me. So, my name's Greg Nolan, aka the Catholic psychotherapist, and I've been working in mental health for quite some time now, so just shy of 20 years. And I've had the joy of having tremendous success, actually, in working with Catholics and Christians to address and overcome anxiety disorders and depression. But it wasn't always this way, so I struggled for many years to reconcile my faith on the one hand, which I knew to be true, with what I was learning in my psychological studies on the other. And I'm sure many of you have been there when you're trying to explore how to work on your mental health and how to become a bit more mentally healthy, how to reconcile what we know to be true from our faith with what we learn from psychological textbooks or modern psychological theory. But ultimately, I was able to bring it all together into a system that I now use with my clients to address difficulties like depression and low self-esteem. And it all boils down to a little known secret that I'm going to talk about later in today's webinar. Okay, but just to talk a little bit about my path. So again, I began working in acute psychiatry on inpatient wards in 2006, so 19 years ago. So the early part of my career was looking at mental health problems from a medical perspective. That's what I worked in for a good many years, actually. And I learned loads, okay? I learned tons about mental health problems. I learned about the medical approach. But I was aware that the medical approach to mental health problems addresses the biological aspect of mental health problems and doesn't really touch upon the soul, the human soul, from a Catholic perspective. And I always have known that we've got a soul and that it can't be reduced to brain activity. So at times when I was working in that setting, it felt a little bit like I was swimming against the tide. But ultimately it prompted me to retrain, and I began to retrain in psychotherapy. Okay, so in 2011 I began training as a therapist, and by 2014 I was working full-time as a psychotherapist. Now, the first type of training that I did was in CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy. And there's lots of good in CBT. In fact, I love CBT. It's a good approach to mental health problems, and it's very effective. But just like many other forms of therapy, it doesn't actually touch on the reality of God or the reality of the human soul in a way that I knew that I wanted to in the work that I was doing. So I began to train in other forms of therapy. I became qualified as an interpersonal psychotherapist, and I even spent time training in psychoanalysis. And what I noticed was that there was lots of conflict between these different psychological modalities, which is understandable. Not everybody is going to agree. But what I also noticed is that none of them actually talked about God directly, talked about our relationship with God, talked about the human soul in the way that the faith talks about our soul, which was a bit frustrating, to be honest, because psychology means the study of the soul. That's what the word means. Psychotherapy means the healing of the soul. So it led to feelings of frustration. But in 2017, I had something of a breakthrough where I left working for the NHS, who I was working for at the time, and started working privately in a way that I could incorporate my Catholic faith. So I was finally free to help clients with Catholic psychology. And that's what I've been working on ever since. Okay, so yeah, I began to use Catholic psychology with my Catholic and Christian clients. So I don't work exclusively, I work with anybody actually, but I always like to make it known that I work from a Catholic perspective. Now, I'm not the first person to look at the connection between the faith and psychology through the lens of the church. There are writings on this, and there's some pretty dense writings that I had to wade through. There's PhD theses and technical books on psychology, and there's lots to learn, but nobody had really put it all together into a succinct and concise system that would be usable and practical and applicable, that anybody could use it. Okay, so nobody had brought this academic work together into a system that could be used psychologically. That is, until now. So what I've done is to bring together all of my learning in terms of psychology from a Catholic perspective and combined it with the best of modern psychology into a system to help people with mental health difficulties. So people like Paul. Paul came to me. Initially he was having difficulties in relationships principally, but it stemmed from an inner insecurity. He was engaged to be married at the time, and he felt regular difficulties and insecurity in his relationship with his fiancée and also with his friends. But using the principles that I'm going to look at today, Paul was able to develop his sense of confidence, his sense of self-worth, his sense of identity, so that his insecurities were basically a thing of the past. Now, Paul sent me a message of thanks, he sent me a message just reviewing the work we'd done together. And he said, what surprised me was the find the issue, solve it, and move on approach. He said it was a breath of fresh air. John is another example. So he texted me saying, what I've gained are the tools that I need to tackle what I couldn't handle before. Or Joan, who messaged me again saying the course of the program is helping me to understand what's behind the depression I had. I do want to say that all of the names that I use in this webinar are pseudonyms. They're not their people's real names, because just for the sake of confidentiality, and if you see photos, it isn't the real person. Okay, so just as a disclaimer, just out of respect for the people that I work with. But I love helping so many people break free, and I'm also really privileged and thankful to have been invited to speak at national speaking events and engagements on talking about mental health from a Catholic perspective. So, if you give me the next 30 minutes, I'll break down some of the essential points of the model for you. Okay, now, if you're on this training right now, chances are you're struggling with low mood and emotional difficulties. And you might be feeling overwhelmed, and you don't understand exactly what's going on and how to move forward with it. And you may have tried many things. So you may have tried medication, you may have tried talking therapies, you may have tried mindfulness. I'm just throwing out some of the things that people access today, which are all really good in and of themselves. So you might have tried couples counselling. If you're religious, you might have tried praying for help or going on retreats or meditation. And I know that all of these things will have been helpful. Okay, so what I propose isn't in opposition or as an alternative to any of these things, but it's looking more fully from a Catholic perspective at the human soul. Now, when we have mental health difficulties, whether it's depression or low self-worth, it inevitably impacts how we relate to other people. So you might find that your difficulties are spilling over, as it were, into your marriage or your relationship with your kids or your friends, which might have left you feeling frustrated or hopeless that anything can actually work, or feeling quite alone with it all. What you're going to learn are the steps to take to live the abundant life that Christ came to give us, the abundant life that he promised us. And we need our faith, okay? So our faith is intrinsic to psychological healing, by definition, which is what I've discovered. You're going to learn how to restore relationships. You're also going to learn how to cut out unhealthy relationships that aren't actually good for you, okay? Now, what I'm about to teach helps with depression, low self-esteem or low self-worth, and relationship difficulties. And it helps with anything, the difficulties that sort of stem from low self-worth, like social anxiety, shyness, okay? But I want to say who this isn't for as well. So this training today isn't for people with OCD or health anxiety or specific phobias or anxiety disorders in general. It's not for difficulties with personality disorders. It's not for severe and enduring mental illness like schizophrenia or bipolar. And it's not going to be very helpful if you're not prepared to do something about the difficulties that you're currently experiencing. So it's a very active approach. It incorporates the faith, but it teaches what we need to do to change things as well. And just a quick disclaimer, this video is for psycho-educational and spiritual formation purposes. It's not a substitute for professional therapy or medical treatment. So I just need to make that disclaimer about today's video. Okay, so if you're still with me, let's dive in. And let's look at the 4 things that we'll be covering in today's training. So the first thing is the 4 biggest mistakes that Catholics make that are keeping them stuck. Okay, so I've seen over the years that there are repeated mistakes that religious people in general make that can keep them stuck. Then we're going to look at the little-known Catholic method of building self-esteem that can't be shaken, that's rooted in God's truth about you. We're going to look at how to master your emotions through the wisdom of Catholic truth so that we can find peace, balance, and strength. And we're going to look at how you can live authentically and connect deeply and meaningfully with other people. I know that difficulties often lead to us feeling fake when we're with other people, or like we're a people pleaser, right? So, the first point, the 4 biggest mistakes that Catholics make that are keeping them stuck. And it's really important to identify these mistakes and get them under our belt because it's a minefield out there, right? So with all the different psychological theories and different approaches to mental health and so much contradiction actually between different psychological modalities, it's very easy to make these mistakes. And I've been there too, right? So I've worked in this field for years and I've made some of these mistakes. Big mistake number 1 is confusing so-called negative emotions with sin. So what are the so-called negative emotions? Hate, anger, despair. Now, this confusion really arises from a confusion of words, because in the church we do talk about the sin of anger, and we do talk about the sin of despair. And modern society has done its damnedest to demonize the passion of hatred, right? Saying you shouldn't feel hate, it's toxic. So we can very easily fall into the trap that things that are very natural to us, so the passion of anger, the passion of despair, thinking I'm sinful if I'm feeling these things. The confusion arises because it confuses the passion of anger and the sin of anger, which are distinct things. Sin is in the will, not in the passions. Okay, so to feel anger isn't a sin. To feel despair isn't a sin. Sin is an act of will, it's a choice that we make. Okay, so the sin of despair isn't the same thing as the passion of despair, any more than the passion of love isn't the same thing as the theological virtue of love. They're distinct. Okay, but it's very easy to confuse. But what this often leads to, what this mistake leads to, is people going to confession and confessing how they felt. And God bless the poor priest if he doesn't actually know whether what you're confessing is a sin, because that can lead to further difficulties, actually. Okay, let's look at big mistake number 2. And big mistake number 2 is what I call the modern approaches to boosting self-esteem that essentially lack a foundation. So, one of the major issues with the modern approach to self-esteem is a completely erroneous idea about self-love. Okay, so love yourself. Now, this obviously raises questions for religious people because we are to love ourselves, but we're to love ourselves healthily with a proper understanding of the self. But the modern approach to self-love is that everything you do is okay, all of your desires should be fulfilled, and it absolutely rejects ideas of virtue and vice and of sin. Okay, so the modern approach to self-love isn't the same thing as the Catholic approach to self-love. The second thing that I want to identify is this believe in yourself mantra. Again, it has truth in it, but it's not very clear. Now, our blessed Lord never taught us to believe in ourselves. Our blessed Lord taught us to believe in him and to root our lives and our actions in him and to direct all of our lives and our actions to him. So our faith should be in him, not in ourselves, actually. Now, big mistake number 3 is what I'm going to label as the positivity movement, which is strongly correlated and linked with this, what I mentioned earlier, about people-pleasing or wanting to be positive in the presence of other people. Now, some of my clients tell me they've fallen into this type of way of thinking, which again labels some emotions as positive and some as negative, and says, well, only try to feel the positive ones, stay positive all the time. Now, Tragically, this mistake is often fallen into by people who've had very difficult childhoods, even experienced trauma or very adverse events in their childhood. And sadly, the attempt to stay positive in the presence of other people actually worsens their difficulties and can lead to lower self-esteem and lower self-worth. So it's very problematic, actually. But we're going to look at the resolution to this. Big mistake number 4 is identifying with depression. So this is who I am. Okay? Now, St. Ignatius talks really well about this in his writings on the discernment of spirits, actually, and we look at that in the model that I use. But this pertains really to any mental disorder, okay? So to identify with a mental disorder, this isn't a good strategy, okay? This doesn't help. And what it does is it leads to feelings of being stuck completely, because if we identify with the problem, we're saying that there's nothing I can do about it. Now, in reality, there's so much that we can do about depression, about anxiety disorders, about low self-esteem, and that's what we're going to look at today. Okay, so the 4 big mistakes to avoid. 1, confusing negative emotions with sin. 2, the modern psychology self-esteem trap. 3, people-pleasing and the positivity movement. And 4, identifying with the problem. Okay. But let's move on to point 2 that we're covering today. So the little-known Catholic method of building self-esteem that can't be shaken, that's rooted in God's truth about you. Okay? Now, low self-esteem is just one part of depression. Depression is like a multifaceted disorder. It's a multifaceted illness, actually. There's many parts to it, but low self-esteem or negative self-evaluation is just one part of it. And you might be experiencing this. Have you ever felt shy or socially awkward, or when you're with other people, have you ever felt less than other people or not good enough? Okay? Now, the Catholic view, which I'm going to touch upon, which is what I've learned over the years, that from a Catholic perspective, there's very much 2 levels to self-esteem. And this is what I've discovered through my clinical practice over the years. There's what I would label as the foundational level, and then the structural level. And what comes to mind for me with this is our Lord's teaching that if we build a house on sand, it's going to collapse when the strong bad weather arises, when the floods and the storms come, right? Now, the modern approach to self-esteem, I would say, just looks at the structural part of self-esteem. And again, what it looks at isn't false, but it's missing the foundation. It misses the foundational part. And the foundational part only comes from the truth of who we are in relation to God and who God is in relation to us. So I just want to look at a few ways that I've seen over the years of addressing difficulties with low self-esteem. The first one is what I would call the checklist method. And the checklist method essentially encourages us to make a list of things that we don't like about ourselves, and then a list of things that we do like about ourselves, and to make the second list longer. Okay? So that we can focus on positive attributes of ourselves. Now, again, this in itself isn't a bad thing, but it isn't the foundation of where our self-worth comes from. And what it encourages us is to focus at a very superficial level, actually. It doesn't get to the core or the heart of our difficulties with self-worth. The next mistake, I would say, that modern approaches take is the achievement trap. Again, there's truth in this. So in reality, engaging in activities that give us a sense of achievement helps greatly with self-worth. It helps greatly with self-esteem. So if you think about, I don't know, a football team in the final of the World Cup and they win the match and they're running around going, yeah, we've won. That's positive self-worth, right? They have a positive sense of self because of what they've achieved. And achievement is crucial, actually. Goal orientation, working toward goals is crucial, but it's not the foundation. So half of that team will go home and celebrate with their wives and family and be overjoyed for months, and the other half will go home and down a litre of whiskey because there's nothing beneath the actual achievement. So again, working to engage in activities that give me a sense of achievement is crucial, but it's not the foundation. Okay, so it's insufficient in and of itself. Now again, the Catholic view is that there's two levels to self-esteem. There is the structural stuff that I've just been talking about, which is very true, very good, very valid, but there's also the foundation. And the foundation is the most important part, because if the foundation is missing, the structural part feels vacuous and empty. Okay? Now, foundational self-worth, and another label that I put to this is radical self-acceptance. And radical, you may or may not know, comes from a Latin word, radix, which means root. Okay, that's the Latin word for root. And radical self-acceptance is rooted self-acceptance. And it links to our sense of identity. Now, as we're all very aware in modern society, there's identity crises left, right, and centre. Okay? But our identity, in truth, is rooted in God, comes from the fact that we're made in the image and likeness of God, and that He loves us. That's where our identity lies, and it doesn't lie anywhere else. Okay? But from that position of radical self-acceptance, so God made me, I'm good in myself, I'm a gift to the world, okay? I'm loved immeasurably. From that place, then we can move into the structural part. Then we can move into looking at activities that give me a sense of self-worth, or a sense of achievement, let's say. And just some examples of the work that I've done with people. So Grace was suffering with depression and like a palpable sense of self-hatred, actually. She had suffered chronically in her childhood and experienced multiple traumas, and as I say, she was profoundly depressed. Now, a major feature of the work that we did was re-establishing a radical self-acceptance within Grace, right? So we looked at the core, the root of her identity, the root of her self-worth, the root of who she is in God's eyes. And Grace's transformation surprised even me, right? And she was an absolute privilege to work with. So I love helping people with this. I love putting back into psychology and back into the helping services the truth that we're made in God's image. So with the system that I've put together, we put the foundation back in place and we become free. Okay, so as I say, when the foundation is in place, it makes us free to explore the world, to do the things that I want to do and not do what I feel that I ought to be doing to make me good enough. Okay? But again, this is only one piece of the puzzle. So low self-worth is just one piece of the puzzle. And this brings us on to the next point in today's webinar. So how to master your emotions. How to master your emotions through the wisdom of Catholic truth to find peace, balance, and strength. Now, there are many ways in which our relationship with our emotions can go wrong. Okay, so this is a little bit different too, although it's related to self-worth, but it's different too. It's a separate part of depression, let's say. One way in which we can relate unhealthily to our emotions is emotional repression or suppression. Okay, so burying our emotions. And one conceptualization of depression suggests that depression is the inevitable consequence of years of repression or suppression. Because if we batten down everything for years, ultimately, we're left feeling like a vacuous, empty space or a desert, right? Because we're just not connecting to ourselves, actually. Another way in which how we relate to our emotions can go wrong is emotional dysregulation. So things feel like they're overspilling for us. Now, one point to make is that both of these things are very common. We all engage in these things to some extent. So as a result of the fact that humanity has fallen, all of us have disordered emotions up to a point. So it's very normal. You don't need to be ashamed of it, and I wouldn't encourage that at all. But whichever way it goes wrong, we can be left feeling overwhelmed and confused. Okay? Now, I'm just going to look at some of the ways that, again, my clients have suggested that they've tried to work on emotional difficulties. You might have tried hypnosis or breath work or mindfulness, and these things might help in the short term. And they're effective. I have philosophical disagreements with a few of these and a few of the ways that people have suggested to me, actually. And some of them aren't actually in line with the Catholic understanding, but I'm not going to get into that in the here and now. But if they've worked temporarily for you, you might still be left feeling a bit confused and no further along in the long term. Because what we need is clarity. We need clarity of understanding about the life of the emotions, about how to relate to them, and we need a path forward. And what the Catholic teaching on the passions gives us is exactly that. And that brings me back to this little known secret, okay, that I talked about at the start of today's webinar. This little known secret is that the Catholic Church has very clear teaching on the passions of the human psyche, or the passions of the human soul. Now, passions and emotions aren't completely synonymous, but there's such an overlap that we can use it interchangeably for the most part, okay? So emotional healing is made very clear by the Catholic teaching on the passions and how we relate to them. Now, the person who talks best about this, and this is basically the secret that I stumbled upon and came across that absolutely transformed the work that I do, is St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, you may or may not have heard of St. Thomas Aquinas. If you're Catholic, you probably have, but you might not know very much about him. He wrote voluminous works on very, very many things. He was a doctor of the church, but one of the things that he wrote about was the human soul. Okay? And he wrote extensive works on the life of the passions, such as anger. Sorry, just to clarify, when I say passions, I mean what most people refer to as emotions, although there's not a complete overlap. So anger, hate, love, desire, happiness, joy, sorrow, etc., and how to relate to them. He wrote how they can become disordered, okay, and an emotional disorder is talked about extensively by St. Thomas, and also what we should do in order to reorder. Now, I'm just going to look briefly, I'm going to touch upon this, okay? So St. Thomas's scheme of the passions. And just to have labels or pegs to hang things on, to have labels for our passions is a really good first step. So, what St. Thomas taught, as well as Aristotle, so all of the philosophy for 1,000 years at least, taught that there's 11 passions that exist in the human person, which are love, desire, happiness, hope, and despair. And those in the left column, all of those under love, relate to something that I perceive as good, okay? A perception of something good. All of those in the right-hand column, so underneath hate, orientate themselves towards something I perceive as evil, okay? And we need all of these passions in order to function healthily in the world. All of these passions are good and serve a purpose, and none of them are sinful, right? Now, it takes a little bit of exploration to see why something, for example, like despair might be a good thing. And despair is good because it alerts me to the reality that I need to make a change. So despair is what we experience when we perceive something on the horizon that's difficult to attain, that I don't feel I can get on the current tracks that I'm on, or with my current skill set or tools, let's say. And what it alerts me to is the reality, I need to make a change. I need to do something differently. So despair, the passion of despair, not the sin of despair, again, it's a distinct thing. The passion of despair, if we relate to it healthily, is crucial and necessary. Again, hate has been demonized in modern society. Anger is pretty much demonized in modern society, often confused with a sin, but step one is the recognition that all of these things are good. All of the so-called negative passions are there to bring me back to happiness. That's why they exist. And I can't get back to happiness without them, without understanding them and knowing how to relate to them healthily. Now, Sandra, when she came to me, again, this isn't my client's real name and this isn't a photo of her, just to clarify that. But when Sandra came to me, she was very repressed, but she was also very resentful and low. Okay? She struggled to set boundaries in certain contexts. But she also had something of an explosive temper. Now, in working with this scheme of the passions that I've just touched upon, she was able to identify firstly what she was feeling, which was very difficult. Like, when I work with people, often they say, well, I feel terrible, but I couldn't, it's difficult to label what I'm feeling. Now, the passions that I've looked at, they're the base terms, you might say. So love, other examples of love are liking or fondness. Other examples of happiness are contentment or satisfaction. So there are nuanced versions of all of the passions, actually. But in working with this scheme of the passions and integrating these passions, ultimately she was able to regulate her emotions, integrate her emotions, which led to her being able to cut out certain unhealthy relationships that were in her life. And she had to courageously take steps to move forward to do that, but she began to live her own life and feel less codependent and entangled with those around her. Okay, so now we have the clarity and the path forward. Okay, and that path is, firstly, the identification of what am I actually feeling here and why am I feeling it. So what is this hatred that I feel oriented towards? Why do I feel despair in this given situation? So it's a clarification, identification, and a clarification. Step 2 is acceptance. That my passion's good, actually. And this, again, very strongly relates to self-worth difficulties, because when we have low self-worth, typically what we reject most strongly in ourselves is our passions, is how we feel. We think I shouldn't feel this way. Okay? So identification, acceptance, integration into myself, and that all brings me to the point of making a free decision as to what to do about it. So deliberate action. What do I do then? Okay? So this is the path: identification, acceptance, integration, bringing me to the point of using my will to make a choice. Now, just some of the responses that I've had from people. Again, Joan said, this course is helping me understand what's behind the depression I had, because it can be very confusing, right? To feel angry or sad or sorrowful every day but not know why sort of doubles the suffering that we're experiencing, because we're not just feeling the difficult emotions, but it's compounded by the fact that we don't know why we're feeling it in the first place. But again, this is just another piece of the puzzle. So let's look at the fourth point in today's webinar. So how we can live authentically and connect deeply and meaningfully with other people. And this is really the cherry on the cake, because firstly we need to do the internal work. But what that allows us to do is to move forward and relate to people healthily. And we all want healthy relationships in our lives. Okay? We all want love, because we're made in the image and likeness of God, who is love. So we're made in love by God, who is love, to be in communion with him and each other, with him who is love, right? But when we have inner emotional difficulties or low self-worth, it can lead to interpersonal problems. Okay? Now, I'm just going to touch on one point of the system that I use. So integrating anger really helps in relationships, which might sound counterintuitive, because a modern approach says we shouldn't feel angry with other people, right? Now, why does integrating anger help? Technically, it's because when I can integrate anger, I can set proper boundaries. Okay, now that might sound a bit counterintuitive. When somebody transgresses a boundary, that's an injustice, right? And the normal emotional response to the transgression of a boundary is anger. And until we can integrate anger, we can't actually set boundaries. Now, we all want healthy, loving, life-giving relationships in our life. That's human and natural and normal. We're in a pretty unhealthy position if we don't want that anymore, by the way. Okay? So we all need, because no man is an island, we're social creatures, so we all want loving relationships, but there's no such thing as a healthy relationship that lacks boundaries. It's a contradiction in terms. Okay? So every healthy relationship, whether it's with your wife, or your kids, or your boss, or your colleagues, or your friends, or the postman, or the milkman, it doesn't matter. Every healthy relationship entails boundaries. But if we can't integrate anger, which is what we've been talking about in the emotional work, we can't set healthy boundaries, right? And it doesn't mean getting angry with people necessarily, although sometimes it might. But the prerequisite is doing just that. Now let's look at an example. So Peter, who I worked with quite recently, came to me and again described feelings of inadequacy, feeling nervous, feeling anxious, lots of self-critical language. And it was triggered around largely his formidable manager, his manager, who he described as formidable. And when we did the emotional integration work, when we focused on the emotions from a Catholic perspective again, what it led to was a building in confidence. It led to him finding his own strength and giving him an ability to say, that ain't happening. I'm not doing that, right? Or we need to have a conversation about this, okay? So what it did was it helped him to build confidence, build a sense of an ability to assert himself, and as a double whammy, it helped with his feelings of anxiety. Okay? And this is because when I know my true identity in God, I can risk being myself with other people. I can take the risk, because that can feel like a risk. So, when I can understand and accept my passions, I can accept others too. So I'm just tying this all together now. So the reason that I can accept others when I can accept myself at a radical rooted level is because if I can't accept how I feel, typically I can't accept it in other people. But when I can understand and accept my passions, I can accept it in those too. You might have had this experience of finding it difficult to accept anger in yourself and finding it difficult to accept anger in other people as well. People often say that to me about their relationship with their kids. So imagine having complete mastery over your emotions, even when they're really powerful and even pushing you to the point of them feeling overwhelming. Okay? Imagine having rock solid self-worth as immovable as your faith in God. Imagine never feeling inadequate in the presence of other people again. And imagine being totally free of feelings of resentment to other people and bitterness. Imagine having relationships which feel joyful and life-giving rather than toxic and painful and destructive. This is the answer, okay? So looking at the whole human person from a Catholic perspective and incorporating the best of modern psychology into a system is going to be truly helpful for you. So, I want you to have what my clients have, okay, which is peace and joy and hope and direction and energy. So, the reality is you might be sitting there today and watching this webinar and thinking back over the past year and feeling no further forward with your difficulties. So what I'd like to do at this point in the webinar is to present you with an opportunity to further explore the system that I've put together and some of the ideas that we've discussed in today's webinar by having a chat with me. And what you'll see in the comments below is that there's a link that you can click that gives you access to a booking system where you can book in a call with me so that we can explore where you're currently at and identify some of the sticking points or blocks that are preventing you from moving forward. Okay, so you can see the link in the comments below and what will happen on that call. So here's what will happen. The first thing is just that I'll get to know a little bit about you and your situation and where you're at on your journey. But then we'll look together at what might be keeping you stuck and preventing you from moving on. And I'm confident that with 20 years of working in mental health that I'm going to be able to help you identify some of the sticking points. I'll also seek to clarify your needs and to identify your goals and create a plan of action to help you move forward with confidence and hope. So I know this call is going to be really valuable for you, and if it feels like a good fit, we may end up talking about the system that I've put together. I do end up working with a few new people each month that I truly believe would benefit from the system that I have to offer, but I am particular about who I work with, and I'd like to let you know that. So I don't work with everybody. It has to feel like a good fit to me and to both of us collaboratively. But who knows, we might really connect on the call, and if it feels like a good match, you might be given the opportunity to work with me in the system that I've created in order to address and tackle depression and low self-esteem from a Catholic psychological perspective, so that you'll be able to find the issue, solve it, and move on, like Steve, or like Edward, who was able to integrate his emotions and develop much healthier relationships with his wife and kids, or again like John, who said he'd gained the tools that he needed to tackle what he couldn't handle before. Now, I do want you to understand that when you book in the call, it isn't a sales call. I'm not going to try and sell you anything on this call. It's just a get to know you call so that I can find out something about where you're at and to help you clarify what might be keeping you stuck, and if we can, create a path to move forward. And if I do feel that working with me will be useful, then I'll talk about that in the call, but I wouldn't make that decision there and then. I might suggest it and discuss it with you and talk a little bit about what that looks like. But then what we'll do is we'll part and both have some time to think about it, and if it's appropriate, to book in a call at a later time where we can discuss working together in a more concrete fashion. Okay, so I'm not going to try and sell you anything in the first call. I guarantee you that isn't how I work. Okay, but when you book in the call, what I do want to give you the heads up with is that once you find an available slot and book in a call with me, what will come up next, what will be populated on the next screen, is a short form for you to fill in. And I do want to say you need to fill in that form, okay? Because what that form gives me is some information about who you are, what the difficulties you're experiencing. It gives me some background information so that we can hit the ground running when we start speaking together. And it's so important to me that you fill in that form that, unfortunately, if you don't fill in the form, I'm going to have to cancel the call, okay? And that's just to allow space for other people who've taken the time to fill in the form, so, respected my time like I will respect yours when we talk together. So please do fill in the form on the next page if you book in a call with me. So that brings us to the end of today's webinar. So I hope you've taken something from today's video. I hope that it's given you some value and some understanding of psychology from a Catholic perspective. So if you feel that you want to take that step out of your comfort zone and think about booking in a call with me, please go ahead and do so. Just click the link in the comments below and we can chat soon. It's been a pleasure talking to you today, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. God bless. Bye-bye.